Good morning. Today is Monday, Dalet Kislev Tovshin Ayin Tes. We are in Teres Menachem Sefer Mamar Vayihiyu Yud Gimel in the Mamar of Shabbos Parshas Shlach. Mevorchem Achedish Tammuz Tovshin Yud Gimel. Dibur Amaschil Vayihiyu Bnei Yisroel Bamidbar. We are on page Kuf Ayin Ches at the second V'chein, the second paragraph beginning with the word V'chein. There are three paragraphs beginning with V'chein. We're at the second one that begins with V'chein. In brief, the Rebbe is addressing Avodas Hashem, serving Hashem, based on the concept of the Mekoshesh Eitzim, the gatherer of the wood, and the explanation of the Zohar that he was comparing, Mekoshesh from the expression of Hekesh, he was comparing the Eitz Hadas and the Eitz HaChaim, the tree of knowledge and the tree of life, which one is greater. The Rebbe was discussing that, particularly the Targum Yerushalmi, who says that the Eitz Hadas was called the tree of knowledge because it had the ability to cause one who eats of it to know the difference between good and bad. The Rebbe said that's not such a terrible thing. That would seem that it would help one fulfill the purpose of serving Hashem, the purpose of the soul coming down here into this world. So to understand this, the Rebbe says we need to explain the whole idea of serving Hashem in three areas: in the actual service of Hashem, in the preparation and the contemplation that brings us to serving Hashem, and in the chain order of creation, in the divine attributes, the Sfirot Elionot, that exist in the realms above. And the Rebbe said that in Avodas Hashem, serving Hashem could be performed in two ways. It could be performed in a limited way, and it could be performed in an unlimited way. And he addressed first the limited and unlimited way of serving Hashem in Torah, Avodah, and Gemilas Chasodim. Actually, the other way around. First he started with Gemilas Chasodim, and then he went into Avodah, and then to Torah. In the first V'chein, on page Kuf Ayin Ches, the Rebbe addressed the deficiency of having limited love, natural love and fear of Hashem, Ahava V'yira Tiviyim, the natural love and fear that a person has, that a Jew has, but which could be limited, and therefore as a result that love and fear doesn't necessarily have to be dedicated to Hashem. There could be circumstances where that love and fear is invested in foreign things and even in things that are opposed to Kedusha, holiness. And now the Rebbe is going to address this concept in Meichen. First he addressed it in the emotions, Ahava V'yira. In the next section, the Rebbe is going to address this, the idea of the Medidah V'Hagbola, the limited aspect, as it is in Meichen, in the intellect of the person. V'chein hu gam b'meichen, page Kuf Ayin Ches, the second V'chein. V'chein hu gam b'meichen, so too it is concerning the intellect of the person, in the mind of the person. What does that mean? Shehu inyan ha'hizbonenus, ha'meviyah la'ahava v'yira. If you recall, in the previous Maimer, on page Kuf Samach Tes, the Rebbe was discussing, when he was discussing Domim Tzemech Chayin Medaber, the inanimate, the vegetable, the animal, and the human, as these categories express themselves in man's service of Hashem. He spoke about Tzemech and Chai being Ahava V'yira Tiviyim and Ahava V'yira Sichliyim. The vegetable and the animal, as it is within man's soul, refers to natural love and fear of Hashem and intellectual love and fear of Hashem. What's the difference between the two? Natural love and fear of Hashem is precisely that. It's a love and fear that the person has naturally. Intellectual love and fear of Hashem means love and fear of Hashem that emanates from hitbonenut, from contemplation. We think about the greatness of Hashem and other matters that bring us to love and fear, and that causes the love and fear to be born, as it were, to come about. It results from the contemplation rather than just the natural love and fear. It comes into being through the contemplation that the person has. It's a higher level, far higher level of love and fear than the natural love and fear. Here the Rebbe is addressing not so much the love and fear that emanates from hitbonenut, from the seichel, but rather the hitbonenut itself. In other words, in Ahava V'yira Sichlim, in love and fear of Hashem, intellectual love and fear of Hashem, you have the love and fear that comes from the seichel, from the contemplation, and then you have the seichel that causes the Ahava V'yira to come into being. So the Rebbe is addressing the hitbonenut, that which the person contemplates, which brings him to love and fear. If we're talking about intellectual love and fear, it results from hitbonenut, from hisbonenut, from contemplation. So he's thinking something in his mind. So where do we find this idea of medida v'hagbala, the limit and the deficiency that results of it? In the hisbonenut, in the contemplation. When the contemplation is with measure and limit, hainu. What does that mean that the contemplation is with measure and limit? In other words, he's contemplating godliness, but he's contemplating a level of godliness which is limited. Which is that? Which level is that? That's the level of godliness that clothes itself internally, immanently, in worlds. And that level of godliness is limited because it is tailored according to the world in which it clothes itself. And being that the world is limited, so the godliness that clothes itself in it must also be limited.
Is the godliness or my understanding?
No, it's the godliness because there are levels in godliness.
I understand that, like we said, it's go down and down, but maybe it's my understanding of that.
Well, it must be the godliness as well, because the existence of the world is real. The Hagbala, the limitation of the world, is real. So therefore, and what's the true existence of the world is the godliness that's within it. So there is a level of godliness that clothes itself in the world, which is limited. It's called Memala Kol Almin, the level of godliness that fills the world. There's a level of godliness, of course, which transcends the worlds, and that's unlimited. But the godliness that clothes itself in the world, just like the soul of the person that clothes itself in the body, the part of the soul that comes into the body is limited according to the body. If it would be unlimited, the body would not be able to handle it. Similarly, the world has a level of godliness which is limited that clothes itself in the world. So when the contemplation that the person contemplates, that brings him to love and fear of Hashem, is in the level of godliness that's b'hagbala, limited, not only is he contemplating a level of godliness that's limited, but how is he contemplating it? Through the garments of his comprehension. And the person's comprehension is certainly what? Limited. So that addresses your question. Even if there is something in the godliness which is, let's say for example, which is not the case, but let's say it is beyond limit, but the person's mind can only grasp a small part of it, a limited part of it. Right? And he doesn't mix into the contemplation something which is beyond limit and measure, beyond measure and limit. So if that's the case, then there is the possibility that the intellect from the opposite side of Kedusha, of holiness, should bring proofs opposing the contemplation that the person has. In other words, challenging the conclusions that the person reaches, and to destroy everything that the person contemplated. In other words, if the person is contemplating godliness in a limited way, a level of godliness which is limited, through the abilities of the person's comprehension, which is certainly limited, and comes to the conclusion that because godliness animates the world, therefore he must love and fear Hashem, there may, being that it's limited, there could be a challenge to that from the intellect of the opposite of Kedusha, that will convince him that it's not the case. And therefore, it will destroy his entire contemplation and its conclusions. In other words, being that the contemplation is measured and limited, then it is possible then the intellect of the opposite of Kedusha could possibly be in a greater measure than the measure of the contemplation in godliness, and that could refute the godly intellect. When we talk about intellect, right? So it's based on an intellectual argument. So an intellectual argument is put forward, facts are put forward that that cause the person to reach that this is the conclusion. If someone comes with a greater intellect, with better arguments, that my conclusions are wrong, I will have to submit that I'm wrong. So being that I'm contemplating a limited level of godliness in this scenario, and I'm not mixing in anything that's beyond limit. I'm focusing on the level of godliness that's limited. And I am utilizing my abilities, my intellectual abilities, which are limited. In other words, I'm not reaching into higher levels. Therefore, my conclusions are necessarily based on a limited scenario, my comprehension. If the le'umazeh, something from the opposite of Kedusha, will come along with a more powerful argument, which is greater than my conclusions, my arguments my intellect that I've utilized for the purpose of my conclusions will fall away. So what's the solution? Therefore, when one contemplates godliness in this scenario, in order to bring to Avavira, so in other words, in the scenario of Avavira Sichliim, intellectual love and fear, when one utilizes intellect to reach certain conclusions in order to bring that love and fear into being, it's not enough just to contemplate the levels of godliness that are limited. It's not enough only to rely on my intellectual capacity, because that's limited, and we could run into trouble if it's limited. We can have an argument which supersedes that. What do I need? What's the solution? I need to bring into the mix aspects that are beyond limit, beyond measure, beyond limit, as the Rebbe will explain later on. What needs explanation? What needs explanation is, it's obvious, because since I'm utilizing my intellect is limited, and I'm contemplating a level of godliness that's also limited. So how can I mix in something that's beyond limit? That the Rebbe is going to address later on in the Maimer. But the point that the Rebbe is making is, following on from what he started, that in serving Hashem, and in the contemplation that brings us to serve Hashem, in the actual service of Hashem, and in the contemplation of serving that brings us to serve Hashem, there is medida v'hakbola, limit, and there is then beyond limit. To do it only in a limited way, to approach it only in a limited way, could be problematic. Why? Because there's always the possibility that something will come into the mix which will refute, which will destroy, which will challenge my approach, and therefore my avodas Hashem, my service of Hashem will suffer. So in order to ensure that that doesn't happen, we need to introduce aspects that are beyond limit. So in the previous section that I've explained what that means in terms of Torah Avodah Gemilas Chasadim, in actual, practical application. And in this section, the Rebbe is explaining how this is more in the emotional aspects, the intellectual aspects, and the soul aspects, as the Rebbe will carry on in the Maimer.